Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is December 15th, 2010, and my guest is Pete Boettke of George Mason University. Pete, welcome back to EconTalk.
Thanks, Russ. Thanks for having me.
Our topic today is Ludwig von Mises, and I hope this might become a model for other podcasts that we'll do down the road. What I want to do is introduce listeners who are unfamiliar with Mises to his key ideas, his key works, and then how someone who doesn't know much about him or about his works, how you might, where would you start? So let's, you and I start, Pete, with the key ideas. Why is Mises important? Tell us a little bit about his life and his contributions to economics.
Mises is sort of the key figure in early part of the 20th century in maintaining and reviving the classical liberal perspective in political economy, his developments in the science of economics that fed into that defense of the laissez-faire system. He became the leading representative of the modern Austrian school of economics. He was a great teacher of economics over in Vienna, where he was teaching at the University of Vienna, while he also had a position at the what would be we would call the Chamber of Commerce. There, he held a position as well as at the university. His students were some of the leading economists in the immigration after they immigrated to the United States, people like Fritz Machlup and Gottfried Haberler, and of course F.A. Hayek, who was his most prominent student.
So when did he come to the United States?
He first moved from out of Vienna to Geneva, where he taught, and then he moved to the United States in 1940.
So, and came to...
He ended up by teaching at New York University from around 1944 until 1969, I believe.
What was he doing between 40 and 44, just out of
curiosity? He worked
curiosity?
in New York City and was a research economist, and I held a position at the National Bureau of Economic Research, NBER. Uh-huh. And he wrote 2 books during that time, Omnipotent Government and Bureaucracy, which were on that his fellowship with NBER. And then he started teaching at New York University's business school, where he taught then from there until the end of his teaching career.
And he had many influential students in the United States as well, right?
Well, yes. I mean, he had influential students both technically that went on to become teachers and develop other people within the sort of market-oriented movement, scientific teachers, and then his 2 most sort of famous students, one in the United States period, one would be Israel Kirzner. The other one is not technically a student in the sense that he got his PhD from Columbia, but was very much influenced, as Murray Rothbard. And both Kirzner and Rothbard were sort of the leading developers of Austrian economics in America. So Mises had a continuing influence in that regard, especially in the discipline of economics, because by the time that those guys are getting their PhDs and developing their unique ideas, Hayek had moved to from London School of Economics to the University of Chicago. But at the University of Chicago, he wasn't really doing technical economics anymore. He was doing more political philosophy, legal philosophy. Yeah.
So let's talk about Mises' work. So what you've said so far, he was an extremely influential teacher and represented an important figure in the development of modern Austrian theory. What was important about his economics work, his work in economics per se?
Well, I mean, I think that Mises is one of the last he's a real generalist as opposed to a specific contribution, which I'll get to in a second, because I believe he made very significant specific contributions as well. But he wrote covering the entire area of economics in the same way that maybe Samuelson did as well for mathematical economics. Mises did for sort of what you might call logical economics.
When you say logical economics, you mean the intuition of how market forces interact. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean by that is mainly
most people like to think they do logical economics as opposed to the alternative. Although we might disagree on who does. People might disagree about who does which kind. But
I mean, Mises contrasts the notion of logical economics from mathematical economics, which were alternatives at the time that were being developed, and that's sort of what I mean by that language. But I think it's important to recognize that Mises, despite the fact that he was always a little bit out of step with the way the profession, to say the least, about that, but he also was recognized. He was the Distinguished Fellow of the American Economic Association in 1969. He was, in fact, there was a large segment of people trying to push to get him the first Nobel Prize in economics. He won the highest Medal of Honor for scientific accomplishment from his own home country in Austria. So it's not like he was completely out of step and not recognized. When his books came out, when his most famous book came out, Human Action, it was reviewed in the pages of the New York Times by John Kenneth Galbraith. Now, Galbraith was a young man at the time, but he still was John Kenneth Galbraith, and people, knew who he was. And it was in the New York Times. Very few of us could ever get one of our books reviewed in the New York Times. Mises's books, when they first were published in the United States, they were published by Yale University Press. So he was very much a kind of a major player in the economics profession, going all the way back to when he was in Vienna. The economics profession was a little different than it is now, and Mises did have his very, very severe difficulties. There's a wonderful biography, very long biography. I don't agree with everything in it, but I think it's extremely good work and very much worth reading, which is by Guido Holzmann, called The Last Night of Liberalism, which is about Mises. And then, of course, there's both Mises himself and his wife wrote stories of his life. His wife, Margit, wrote a book called My Life with Ludwig von Mises, and Mises himself wrote a book called Notes and Recollections, which is more about his Vienna period than so we can learn a lot about Mises, the person, and his struggles and whatnot. And he did have very heroic struggles. On his ideas, I would say that he made contributions to monetary theory, which was his original work, which is the development of the Austrian theory of the business cycle. Mises, as Mises sometimes would say, he didn't understand why people called it the Austrian theory of the business cycle. He said the only people who are adherent to it is a Swede, Wicksell, and one Austrian, him, Mises. So, he didn't understand, but he liked the fact that people would call it that. But he developed this theory which focuses on how the interest rate mechanism can, through manipulation of money and credit, can mislead investors, and you can generate the boom and bust cycle through manipulation of money and credit. And that really was his development of that, and more other works in monetary economics was his first major contribution in a book called Theory of Money and Credit.
When did that come out? It
originally came out in 1912. He received his PhD in 1906. He was a student of Bombaverick, and it was part of the Bombaverick seminar. And he developed the idea of integrating. Basically, he was a first mover in the micro foundations idea. So if you think about economics,
it's neo-Austrian.
Yeah. If you think about economics back in that time, you had monetary courses, and then you had your economics courses, which is relative prices, right?
What we would call micro today.
What we call microeconomics. There was no such thing as macroeconomics, but there was money economics, monetary economics, which was not necessarily always integrated with what you learned in microeconomics. And
like today.
And what Mises did was he integrated microeconomics to address microeconomics with the monetary economics. And then coming out of that led to this development of how the manipulation of money and credit can influence a price, a relative price, in this case the interest rate, and guide people the wrong way for some period of time, and then you get a self-correction mechanism, all right? So you have a distortion, then a correction, and that explains the boom and the bust cycle. And so in that sense, Mises's theory of the business cycle is a price theoretic theory of the trade cycle. Yeah.
So let me ask you, let's pause for a moment in discussing his contribution, because I want to ask you a history of economic thought question related to that business cycle work. So Hayek is his student.
Yeah.
And Hayek's important work on the business cycle in the 30s is what? What does he write?
Well, I mean, Hayek starts in the 1920s working on the problem of imputation, which is, the idea of how is it the value of capital goods derived from the consumer goods they go to satisfy, and how is that value flows up through that chain. That's the value is imputed back. So he originally worked on that, which is the nature of intertemporal coordination, right? How is it that we get information to build cars for people that will consume those cars 10 years from now, but people right now are working on designs and whatnot. Right. How is that not just a mess, right? Well, there's signals that flow back so that businessmen rely on to be able to justify those investments. And Hayek worked on that problem, which means that he started working on capital theory. And then what happened is that he goes to work for Mises. He technically wasn't, Mises's student. He was a Wieser student at the university, though.
Wieser was an economist.
He was at University of Vienna as well. And that's who, was his thesis advisor and whatnot. And, but we have we have a picture now of Hayek's report card, and we do know that the way they did it at the University of Vienna, people would sign off on the grades, and Mises did sign off on a grade. So he did have Mises in some form as a teacher.
Supervisor or teacher, whatever, yeah.
He never remembers it, and Mises doesn't remember it really.
But it's the influence that really. Yeah. When we call him Mises' student, it's because of the influence that his ideas had.
It's because what happened was he goes to work for him at the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research.
Okay.
Well, he goes to work for him at the Chamber of Commerce.
Which is what year? What are we in now, roughly?
Mid to early 20s.
So the world's booming at.
And what happens is Mises arranges to help Hayek get a research fellowship to come to the United States. Mises, again, going back to the early thing, was very much respected and was involved with a version of the Rockefeller Foundation that tried to support European intellectuals coming to the United States and studying with people here. And so Hayek went to Columbia University, where he worked with Wesley Clare Mitchell.
Early
20s.
Chronicler of the business cycle.
Yeah, early chronicler of the business cycle.
Figure in that.
And they were developing at Columbia the idea of time series analysis to study business cycles, statistical approach to business cycles. And so Hayek went there and then came back to Austria, and then he went to work with Mises at the Chamber of Commerce, and then eventually Mises and Hayek started an institute called the Austrian Institute for Business Cycle Research. And Hayek became the director of that, and then they started these studies, and they started to study the boom and bust cycle, and a lot of people claim, but I have, like a lot of things, a broken clock gets the time right twice a day. So if you take a sort of, this inflation's going to cause a recession or whatnot, then it happens, and you say, they
were geniuses.
Yeah, but I mean, it is definitely the case that their theory sort of pointed out that the manipulation of money and credit would have a cost to it, and they developed this idea. To back up a bit and to get a little bit technical, but push me off of it if it's too much, is that what's kind of interesting is at the time that Mises starts out developing his monetary theories, we have two different competing ideas. One of them is that there's no connection between the supply of money and the prices in an economy. These are what Mises calls monetary cranks. In monetary cranks, the problem is a lot of times you look at the world and you see people that are poor and you say, they lack money. Let's print money and give it to them. That will fix our poverty problem. And then there's the other types, which are the quantity theory, right? Which is that if you double the money supply, you're going to double the price level.
That's Irving Fisher.
Different
kind of crank, but pretty respected.
No,
guy.
Totally. And in fact, the quantity theory is one of the most important ideas because, basically, if you're not going to make everyone better off by printing money, right? You're just going to make prices go up, and so there is a relationship between the quantity of money and and the price level in the economy. And what Mises does is he says, okay, he defends the quantity theory, but he argues that we can't have a mechanical interpretation of the quantity theory. So the classical dichotomy, so the classical economists argued that reals only affect reals and nominals only affect nominals. And this
that means that real things matter and really determine the quality of our life. Things like the number you attach to the price of something isn't so important if your wages are also higher.
Right.
If both prices and wages are higher, your standard of living is unchanged. Yeah. So you wouldn't expect printing money to necessarily impoverish or enrich. It's going to eventually be washed out by the real underlying things.
I tell all my students that, look, the only way to increase real income is to increase real productivity. And the way to increase real productivity is to increase your human capital, increase the machinery that you're working with, or increase the managerial talent that pools or, does that, right? And so that's the sort of the bottom line. You want to increase real productivity in an economy. That's what the source is of generating real income increase. Mises doesn't deny that, but what he argues is that if we don't take the quantity theory of money viewed mechanically underestimates the distortionary consequences of inflation, because it's as if as soon as I double the money supply, prices are going to double instantly, and then of course there won't be these consequences with it. The only cost of inflation is that menu costs.
You got to change the numbers.
You got to change the numbers around. So Mises wanted to show that, and this is a great innovation on his part, was that because of injection effects and the way that prices move through an economy, they adjust through relative price changes, not a whole price level change. Eventually it works out to be, the math is going to work out that way. You double the money supply, eventually all prices in the economy are going to adjust. But the short run,
intermediate,
and so Mises is showing that in the short run, there can appear to be a case in which an effect on a nominal variable can have a real impact.
Because you distort your choices and how you allocate your resources.
And that's what sets up the business cycle. Right. So, and we still have this debate today because the arguments about real business cycles and all that stuff are all connected up with these debates. And Mises was really at the core of that, and Hayek was right with him. They were partners. I have a picture in my office of Hayek and Mises working together, and I have always viewed this sort of Austrian tradition as one of a Mises-Hayek tradition, even though there's subtle and profound differences between the two of them. And it would be foolish for me to deny that as a matter of history of ideas, but as a contemporary person working in the Austrian tradition, I view it as the Mises and Hayek tradition. And I always tell the students what you should do is read Mises as a Hayekian. What I mean by that is read Mises looking for all the emphasis on spontaneous order and invisible hand, and read Hayek as a Misesian, in which what you're doing is seeing in Hayek the logic of choice, the sort of
prices.
and all these things. And when you do that combined reading, then you end up by seeing how it is that we can actually change the way we think about economics today. But let me just...
I got you off track, but I want to stay on that track because I want to get to a question I'm really driving at, which is Mises in 1912 writes The Theory of Money and Credit. He gets linked up with Hayek in the 20s at a time when the world's booming. The bust comes with the Great Depression, whether they foresaw it or not, as you say, is always uncertain, but they certainly had a framework for interpreting it as the result of an excessive boom driven by cheap money, too low interest rates that were too low, distorted choices, et cetera. What was Hayek's major work in that period on the business cycle?
Well, he wrote a book called Monetary Theory and the Trade Cycle.
When did that come out?
The German edition of that is in the 1920s.
And Keynes reviews it. Is that the book that Keynes? No. So Keynes reviews The Theory of Money and Credit, or what?
Well, The Theory of Money and Credit, Keynes reviews and says that he can't really judge how good it is because he only knows what German he already knows, and then he says it doesn't say anything new in the book.
The reason I'm asking these questions is I'm curious, as a history of economic thought, an intellectual thought question. Why is it that in the 1930s? It's Hayek who's sparring with Keynes,
and not Mises.
That's what I'm driving at.
It's a great question,
and that's what the world looks back at
and remembers.
Yeah.
Now, what's fascinating about that story is that during the 1920s, Mises' seminar in Vienna, in which Hayek is a major participant, becomes a world-renowned center for economic scholarship. Frank Knight speaks in it. A lot of different people
Is
come.
Schumpeter? Where's Schumpeter?
Schumpeter's part of it, but then not. Schumpeter and Mises were classmates, and Schumpeter's kind of a shining star, but then as often referred to, the enfant terrible of the Austrian school, because he kind of rejects the teachings of the school and then becomes more of Walrasian, and it becomes
his own thing.
He does his own thing, and it becomes complicated. But what's fascinating is that one of those people that came and participated in the Mises seminar is Lionel Robbins. And
Who's at the LSE.
Who's at the LSE. And Lionel Robbins goes back to the LSE, and he wants to take what he learned in the Mises seminar and bring it to the London School of Economics. He writes The Nature and Significance of Economics.
What year is that?
It comes out in 32, I think, or 33, somewhere around that. But he's already working on these ideas. He's defending a lot of the Mises positions. One of the things that we're skipping over here is that Mises is simultaneously involved in a debate over socialism as well, which I'd like to come back to.
We will get to that.
So Robbins,
it was probably going to be a 3-hour podcast. So sit tight, curl up with something like a thing of hot chocolate on these winter nights, and hope you're along for the ride. Keep going. It's not really going to be 3 hours. That was a joke. Go ahead.
But Mises is anyway. Robbins gets himself situated at the LSE, and what happens is he brings Hayek over, and Hayek produces his set of lectures called Prices and Production,
right.
And that becomes this sort of famous, where everyone becomes a Hayekian when he gives these lectures.
LSE.
And that's in 1931 that he gives those lectures. One of the great thrills of my life is that I actually gave a Hayek memorial lecture at the LSE in 2004, and I was told I gave it on the same stage that Hayek gave his Prices and Production lecture. I don't know if that's true. Someone told me that, but that's my story. I'm sticking with it.
It sounds good.
And it was awesome to do. But Hayek, I think, the answer to your question is at this time, not many of Mises's writings are in English. Uh-huh. And Hayek is starting to write in English audiences. Mises is he writes another book in the late 20s called On the Manipulation of Money and Credit, which is a very detailed discussion of the business cycle and whatnot, a more mature discussion than, let's say, he had just in the theory of money and credit. But neither the theory of money and credit nor the on manipulation of money and credit are translated into English yet. And so he's still a German language scholar. Even when he goes to Switzerland Switzerland in the 30s, he's writing in German. He's not writing in English, right? It's not until you get a little later that you start seeing Mises's, transition into an English language economist. So Hayek is the English language representative of the Austrian school. Plus, he's a young man. He's in his very 30s, and he's obviously very bright and talented, and he becomes a kind of, focal point for the anti-Keynesian argument. And that was not only in academics, but also, remember in the 30s, Hayek is writing in the Times of London, and he's joined by Robbins. And I really do think that, Lionel Robbins plays a major role in that intellectual history because he and Hayek have a very strong notion that this upstart LSE school is going to take on the Oxbridge orthodoxy in the English language of economics, and they get their own journal and things like that. And the real irony in Hayek's story is that, by the way, the Hayek story is a great name that Hicks gave to this period of time. Hicks wrote an article called The Hayek Story, and he says, when the definitive history of the 1930s get to be written, and what a drama it was, one of the main characters will be F.A. Hayek, because at the time, none of us knew who was right, Hayek or Keynes.
And now we know.
And he was writing at the time that you knew, and now we're back to the same thing. So, I go back to your, rap video, and, you say we've been battling back and forth for a century,
Right,
that's actually true.
And
it's still going. So Hayek becomes the representative of the Misesian position in the English language world, as does Robbins. So Robbins becomes the defender of Mises's position on methodology, and Hayek becomes a defender of Mises's position on substantive economics, both in terms of the business cycle and Austrian capital theory and monetary theory, and then its integration into the Austrian business cycle theory, but also on the debate with socialism. So, Mises, in some sense, Hayek is very different from Mises, but he's also in a large way his greatest student, in the sense that he picks up the Misesian positions in the debate in the English language world.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious, just as a historical footnote, Mises was Jewish.
Yeah. He's
in Austria at a time when we're talking about the mid-30s, when Hitler is on the rise in Germany. There's talk of unification of Austria and Germany, and it was not a good time to be a Jew in either place. Did he have personal issues with anti-Semitism and fear of Nazism? I assume that's what pushed him to Switzerland and the United States. Did it also affect his ability to work, given what was going on in the universities?
Yes, I mean but it goes back even deeper to in the 20s. So the standard argument, Mises, again, the Holtzman biography and also Notes and Recollections and Mrs. Mises's book are very useful for people to look at on this. But the standard story is that Mises was second in line a lot of times for some major appointments at the university. So it's not that he wasn't considered for the positions, but he would be considered for a big chair and then come in second.
Didn't quite get it.
Didn't quite get it. But it's not that he wasn't considered at all. And the argument is that a man of his stature, should have gotten those things, a man of his accomplishment, which is an obvious argument that seems to be true. And the argument that people say in retrospect is that, look, the problem is that Mises was, one, a classical liberal. Two, he was a very strident debate partner. So it's not like he backed off in debates or tried to be, he wasn't Millie Mouth, right? Yeah. And then three, he was a Jew. And the argument is that you could survive if you only had two of these, but you could never survive all the way through if you had all three.
So that handicapped some of his professional accomplishments in his career in the 20s. But in that crucial period, I'm thinking of the, say, 33, where Hitler comes to power in Germany. From 33 on, a Jewish scholar in Austria must have been a little bit uncomfortable.
Well, it's
increasingly uncomfortable.
Russ, it's a fascinating story, and it's been sort of immortalized in a DC Comics because what happens is Mises's library gets confiscated. So his library is confiscated, and then eventually by the Nazis.
What year are we in now?
In the 30s. Uh-huh. And then what happens is that when the Nazis are taken over, then his library is reconfiscated by the Soviets. And so then what happened when communism collapsed was his library was discovered over in Moscow, and people like Richard Ebeling and some other scholars have been worked in those papers, discovered those papers, and in fact, Ebeling with Liberty Fund has brought out the selected works. So along with the collected works of Mises, which Liberty Fund has been doing, the selected works of Ludwig von Mises are made up. Many of those papers are papers that Richard Ebeling discovered when he was over in Moscow and does the editing for.
And I ask that because I just wonder what role that historical episode it played in his being less of a voice relative to Hayek. So part of it was Hayek was writing and speaking in English and was physically in England, though, whereas Mises was stuck in Austria at a time when he was worried about his life and really wasn't as, I assume, academically engaged and as productive.
Well, he left to go to Geneva. But even Geneva is not LSE. So, Mises made choices of where he went. Now, those were the options. He had, during the period of time in the 1930s when he was in Geneva, that is a period of tremendous productivity for him research-wise. Okay. And he writes the first edition of what later becomes Human Action. It's published in German in 1940. Bad timing for a book to come out, a weighty scholarly book as well, and published in German. So again, his audience is limited and whatnot compared to what he would reach when he comes to the United States. So it just so happens, I think, that Hayek, if you look at Mises' students, you got Hayek going to the London School of Economics. You have Machlup being able to go to eventually end up teaching at Johns Hopkins and then at Princeton. You have Habeler going to Harvard. You have Morgenstern going to Princeton, right? I mean, so his students and the people around him, even someone like Alfred Schutz, who was a sociologist who worked with him, went to the New School for Social Research in New York City. Those are bigger positions in some sense to launch your academic ideas from than the college in Switzerland that he was teaching at. But his story, again, of escaping from Vienna to go to Switzerland and then from Switzerland to come to the United States is, a great drama, one of personal high-risk stakes and all of these kind of issues that makes Mises an extremely compelling character to study and to learn about and stuff.
But let's get back to the idea. Yeah. So we started with his contribution to trade cycle theory. We used to be called trade cycle theory. Now we call it business cycle theory, the boom and the bust cycle. So he starts that in 1912, revises it in the 20s, and then influences a whole cadre of scholars who, in English, push those ideas, obviously with their own twists and permutations, and variations. But so that's one important contribution he made intellectually was the modernization of Austria and really the creation of what's now called Austrian business cycle theory.
Right.
Give us what else he's important for.
Well,
calculation debate was, I think,
right. In 1919, he publishes a book called Nation, State, and Economy, which is his criticism of the war, and in particular his examination of war planning during World War I. That is then followed up with the idea, because at the time, see, one of the big things that was in the zeitgeist at the time was that war planning was a model for peacetime because it proved to be so efficient during wartime. Okay?
Same zeitgeist that got created after World War II.
Yes, yeah, and because of the Great Depression, right? Milton Friedman has a great line where he says, people believe the Great Depression did two things. The Great Depression and World War II did two things. One of them, it demonstrated that free markets are unstable, and two, that government planning, can actually work, and therefore we're going to
because D-Day. Yes. They got on the beach and they were successful.
And so I think that zeitgeist is already in the air. Mises, and this wonderful book, Nation, State, and Economy.
That quote from Friedman was how people perceived the Great Depression. That's not what he believed.
No, he argues that's the thing that we have to argue against.
Yeah, okay, go ahead. Sorry. Yeah, to make that clear.
So when we're
1919.
So we're in 1919. At the time, especially a gentleman who was Mises's classmate in Bombaverick seminars, a man named Otto Neurath, and he was developing the ideas. So people's faith in capitalism is shredded,
because we've had this post World War I crisis, a lot of poverty,
civilization is collapsing.
There's revolution in the air, both in Russia and Weimar Republic's getting started, and there's problems.
And so
hyperinflation's
hyperinflations. And so Otto Neurath believes that you could have what's a Marxian idea of a natural economy, and that by eliminating production for exchange and substituting only production for direct use, you could actually have a burst of productivity, eliminate the sort of class warfare, and lift the average man into a new world order. And Mises picks up pen to paper in this debate, and he points out, he says, this is as he says in one of his books, he says, socialism, we have to admit, is one of the grandest ideas of all of mankind, and we have to deal with it in the utmost seriousness. And he does, and he writes a paper called Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth in 1920. And in that paper, what he identifies is what he believes to be, and I agree with him on this, but what he believes to be the linchpin argument against socialism. And it's not just that the socialists would not have the incentives to be able to do what's right. because in your debate partners, one of the things I think is important to remember in these discussions is, your debate partners. So one of the assumptions that the socialists were making was that when you change the nature of the institutional structure, you would change the nature of the human beings that populated that world. So you would get a socialist man
who'd have different, even though the incentives that capitalism or man is used to wouldn't be there.
Right.
He'd have the higher ideals that would motivate him to do for the common good rather than just for his own paycheck.
Right. Yeah. And so Mises has to defeat that argument. So what he does is
an anthropological argument.
Yeah. So
as a psychological argument.
So because one of the oldest arguments in all of human history is the argument that collective property produces poor incentives. It goes all the way back to Aristotle's Critique of Plato, right? Or, and so we have this argument and the idea that communal property doesn't produce very good incentives and whatnot. And as you've probably talked about on the show, we have plenty of experience with this. Like, say, for example, we just celebrated Thanksgiving and, the discussion about the true meaning of Thanksgiving. So it's not that argument is, what Mises stresses, though, is that for the sake of argument, let's assume that that this gentleman, is transformed. This human being is transformed. The question is, how is it that the chickens are going to end up in the mouth of the comrades, right?
Yeah.
And so it's even if you had solved the incentive problem through some kind of heroic community spirit or reformation of humanity, the problem is that you're not going to have the ability to engage in the calculation about how to use scarce means to obtain the objective ends that you want. And so this is Mises's calculation argument. And he lays that out. That's why it's called economic calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. And that is a linchpin argument against socialism, claiming that socialism will have to do without economic calculation, which means that socialism will not be able to achieve its own ends. So
it's a brilliant argument because unlike the sort of the incentive argument is basically saying, you're not going to get much output because people are going to free ride.
Right.
They're going to take advantage of other people contributing. Everyone's going to try to do that. And as a result, people are going to loaf and output's going to be very small. Instead, he took the assumption they made that, no. There's going to be a new economic man. He's going to be able, and woman, they're going to work like crazy because they'll be, unlike the capitalist system where they're self-motivated, they're going to be motivated for the common good. He said, even under that world, you've got a serious problem.
Right. Yeah, and
which became the argument they lost on intellectually.
Right.
It wasn't the argument they lost on maybe in practice.
Right.
In practice, I think they lost because they didn't produce the goods.
Yeah.
And there was an immense amount of loafing under the so-called socialist revolution, but the intellectual debate on the calculation problem became the central intellectual question of the 20s and 30s.
Yes. And it becomes a major issue later on after Hayek interprets it in the way that modern economics developed in information economics and whatnot
use of knowledge
as well.
in society.
But Mises, I think the reason why Mises's argument is so important is because the vast amount of intellectuals thought at the time when they ever saw socialism fail in the past, it was always that we didn't try hard enough.
Right, we didn't get the
sense.
real.
And so it was always that socialism is a wonderful ideal, but humanity failed to live up to it. Whereas what Mises is pointing out is that socialism is a bad idea because it fails to live up to the demands that are required for humanity.
A modern life.
Yeah.
A tribe, a family, that's one thing,
Right.
but a
That's
modern
right.
society of relative strangers in large numbers, you're not going to have that work very well.
What Mises later on develops is the notion of what capitalism generates is what he calls the social cooperation under division of labor. And the problem with socialism is that the very mechanisms, institutional and economic mechanisms at work are not going to be able to generate that social cooperation and a division of labor. And it's that social cooperation and division of labor that's the source of our ability to have the shoes that you have without you knowing that, who made those shoes for you, or what, Leonard Read and then Milton Friedman later on made famous by holding up a pencil and saying, none of you know how to make this pencil. The reason why the pencil is able to access that vast amount of division of labor worldwide is because of the various price signals When I talk to my students now, I try to summarize the Mises point by saying, look, you need property, prices, and profit and loss. Yeah. And you have property, price, and profit and loss give us incentives, information, and innovation. And without the 3 Ps, you can't get the 3 Is. If you don't have those 3 Is, you're not going to be able to make that pencil.
3 Is are
incentives, information, and innovation. Yeah.
Now, he writes that paper in 1920.
20, yeah.
The so-called socialist calculation debate takes place over space and time, with Mises, Hayek on the side saying you've got a execution and logistics problem.
And Robbins. Yeah.
And on the other side, you have Abel Lerner.
Yeah.
Is the one that I know of. Who else is that important?
Well, what happens is Mises publishes a book in 1922 called Socialism. And it has this huge impact among the people in his inner circle in the seminar back in Vienna, of which Robbins comes and visits and becomes a convert.
And I'm going to just mention a lot of the books we're talking about here of Mises are available online at no charge at the Library of Economics and Liberty. We're putting links up to all of them. And again, we're going to get in a little bit to the question of which are the most influential ones and where might you start. So but carry on. So he writes this book in 22.
So he's German language debate. So his German language debate is with people like, for example, Jacob Marshak, and
who becomes
a famous economist,
right?
and so, but that's a debate that takes place in German. When Hayek moves to the LSE, he becomes the representative in English. Again, Mises's book is not available in English yet, and his article doesn't become available in English until Hayek brings it out in a collection called The Collectivist Economic Planning. So Hayek publishes a book in 1935, which is a summary of the calculation debate, all in English, called Collectivist Economic Planning. And Hayek writes the introduction and the conclusion for that debate, and that volume, excuse me, and that's where this, the position is laid out, and Mises's argument, that's the first time it appears in English. So Hayek students, it's important to remember now, Oscar Lange is not a student, but Abel Lerner is.
Of who?
Of Hayek.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he's Hayek's student at the LSE. And Oscar Lange also tries to pick up the challenge to take Mises's position and show Mises to be wrong on his own terms. So you have Lange trying to do that. You have Lerner trying to do that in the 1930s, and Hayek is the responder to that. But there's also gentlemen like Dickinson and some other people that were in the English language. It really became a kind of an LSE-centered debate with some discussion in the United States. Fred Taylor had published a paper on the use of marginalist principles in the socialism under socialism, and so basically the idea is that in a Walrasian economy, there's no false trades take place.
A Walrasian economy is a mathematically based world of N people and X goods and Y.
And there's that we know that there's some conditions under the conditions of perfect competition, which will lead to a situation where price will equal marginal cost, and output will be at that level, which minimizes average cost. And we know that we'll get exchange efficiency and production efficiency in that world, right? So what the market socialists did was they tried to use the marginalist principles as guide tools towards the socialist planning.
They said we just need a big computer, which they didn't have at the time, but they imagined it. They said we have a lot of equations. We just need to input what people like and how much they make, how much they produce, and we'll put the relative prices in and figure out how much each person should get out of how many chickens this guy gets, and this guy doesn't like chicken, so we'll give him turkey or we'll give him vegetables. And
so that's totally different from the original debate with Marxists, right, who weren't going to, remember the original debate was we're going to substitute production for exchange, we're going to get rid of and put in production for direct use. Now what we're doing is we're actually saying, how can we get the socialist planner to mimic what the market would do if the market were operating, but we were in control of the market?
Which we might have to do because there really isn't going to be perfect competition and we don't have all the conditions.
Well, Lange actually makes an argument that socialism be identical to pure theory of capitalism in theory, but in practice will outperform, because in practice, real capitalism suffers from monopoly and business cycles.
Sure.
And you got to remember, at this time, you have the Burley mean stuff, which is about the separation of ownership and control, creates problems. So in the heads of someone like a Lerner, Alanga, he points, in fact, to that the work by.
We're in the 40s at this point, right?
No, we're in the 30s.
Came out in the 30s?
No, in the 30s. Yeah, their original discussions of that, and he points to that and says, "Look, see, capitalism suffers from a separation, ownership, and control problem.
They got their own incentive problems, which of course it does. Yeah.
And so they're going to be messed up, but we're going to be able to be in control and therefore be able to manage it, and we won't have the business cycle, and we'll be able to do this." And so that's now where Hayek has to jump in and then find the response to that. And that's how the relationship between Mises and Hayek is as well. So like, I just got done teaching this semester my history of thought class, and I said the way to understand the history of modern economics is to think of it in terms of debate partners and who it is that your debate partner is. And each time it switches, something all of a sudden changes. So think about it like in your case, you were educated at University of Chicago. Milton Friedman was debating with different people than who Bob Lucas ended up by debating with. Right. So Milton Friedman is talking in the beginning, when we were all undergraduate students, Milton Friedman's main adversary is probably someone like Walter Heller.
Correct.
Right. And then all of a sudden you get later on, and then, it's a different debate when you're talking about who Bob Lucas is trying to criticize.
But similarly, even though Lucas and Friedman have lots of theoretical disagreements, they're on the same debate team.
Yeah, right. And I think
like Keynes, like Hayek and Mises.
Yeah,
and
I think it's the same way.
And certainly Lucas would proudly admit to being influenced by Friedman in all kinds of ways,
right.
and learning from him.
And I think it's the same kind of thing here. And so Hayek is, he's addressing and also Hayek, you ask about the question of why it is that Hayek becomes a person. Hayek also writes the journal article. Hayek is a 20th century economist. Mises, in a large part, always remains a 19th century economist, right? In the sense that he made his main contributions through books. Whereas Hayek is writing, he's editing Economica, he's writing journal articles. Like when we think about Hayek and you say, what do you think about Hayek? You might say The Road to Serfdom, but if you ask an economist, what do you think about Hayek? They'll say the use of knowledge in society. So they'll pick a journal article, right? Mises is writing these books, and Hayek is writing journal articles, and the debate takes place in journal articles back and forth.
So I want to leave this and move on, but I think there are two things I think they're important about this. One I never thought of before, which is, and I hope I remember the second, but the first is this calculation debate argument about whether socialism is superior to capitalism. It's taking place in the middle of capitalism's greatest crisis.
Right. Yeah.
I've never thought about this. So in the 20s, when socialism is very much on people's minds, we're in the post-World War I was a very disillusioning event in Europe and in the United States, but not as much in the United States. But in Europe, there's a huge disillusionment with the old order. And so people are looking for alternatives. There's this romance about socialism. And von Mises stands athwart that train and says, stop, this isn't going to work, which is a very brave thing to do in 1922. But it's good economic times, at least, for capitalism. In the 30s, they're still saying stop at a time when a lot of people are desperately looking for an alternative to capitalism. They're still saying this isn't it,
right?
Which I never thought about. The second point I want to make is important for those who aren't familiar with this episode of intellectual history. Correct me if I'm wrong. This is one of the rare, very rare, intellectual disputes where there's an immense amount of passion and intellectual effort and volume of words on both sides where there's a winner. The people who are representing the socialist side, they said, we lose. Certainly the world just picked a winner, which was Mises and Hayek and Robbins. But I think even the protagonists in the debate conceded that they lost. Is that correct? Well, Lerner and Lange and those folks said, ultimately, we had the wrong view. Is that correct?
You mean at the time?
Not at the time. Eventually.
Eventually. Yes. I mean, what happens is Robert Hallbrenner, for example, writes a New Yorker article after the collapse of communism in 1989 and says Mises was right. which is an amazing thing to
DeLong
have.
wrote a similar article in the late 90s saying that Hayek was right. Yeah. This is the one thing we've learned is that markets work really well at most things. We would disagree about where the most is and what's left over, where the fraction is.
But I think we went through a very long period of time where people believed that in fact the opposite position.
They're always the Soviet system works better, but they don't have as much freedom. Their economy is more efficient than ours. Which was not true.
I edited a 9-volume reference work, which is not available for free. It's a library work called the Socialism versus the Market, and it's a documentary history basically of the intellectual debate over economic calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, going back with excerpts from Marx and then Neurath, and then developing Mises's argument, and then going up and carrying it all the way to the modern period of time. 9 volumes. Routledge published it in around 2000, and so this debate went on for a very long period of time in which people thought, in a weird way, what happened was both sides declared victory. So Mises and Hayek never said that they had lost the debate. They argued that the other side, failed, and the other side argued Mises and Hayek lost the debate.
And they could maintain that because there was not a lot of good data on how the Soviet Union was really doing.
Well, and as I've pointed out in my own work on this, what happened was the theoretical debate, went into various different mathematical modeling exercises, and the empirical debate went into growth theory. So it actually became macroeconomics estatements of growth rates rather than the kind of microeconomic evaluations that Mises and Hayek would have wanted you to look at. Right. So, but what happened is the
debate went on to a different turf.
Yeah, what happens is our anecdotal evidence, all sort of fit with the Mises story. So like the 1-ton nail kind of things, where the Soviet planners decide that they need a ton of nails, so the Soviet firm produces one giant ton nail, right?
Is that a true story? Or is
no, I mean it's apocryphal, and it's something that they would make fun of themselves about themselves because they would produce the quality of the goods that were produced. I mean, when socialism collapsed, one of the things that we found out was the phenomenon of what's called negative value-added firms in which the value of the inputs are greater than the value of the outputs that they go to produce. Which to me, you say, I agree with you, by the way, that in the real world there's incentive issues that are overwhelming, but there's also these calculational issues, and I think this negative value-added firm thing is a calculational issue. They didn't have an idea of how to calculate the efficient use of resources in these things.
Because they didn't have prices.
Because they didn't have prices. They didn't have real prices. So anyway, so Mises, the socialist calculation debate becomes a central thesis, and eventually what happens is Mises and Hayek come to understand that their conception of the nature of the market, what it means to Hayek writes an essay called The Meaning of Competition. And Mises starts using the term and developing the term in analysis called the market process, as opposed to equilibrium states of affairs. And that approach, analytical approach, follows on the heels of what they learned in their debate with other economists over socialism, because what other economists were doing was going to the equilibrium end states and then saying, well, geez, if the equilibrium end state is defined as X, I can just say under socialism, let's assume X, and then we've mimicked what it is that capitalism would deliver. And Mises and Hayek said, no, we have to explain how it is that X comes about, how it emerges from the exchange behavior of individuals.
Because you can't really take tastes as given, you can't take endowments as given. That's all. That's an illusion that makes the math look nice, but in real practice could never be implemented.
And so, Hayek.
The best piece on this, by the way, I think is Buchanan's very short note that we've linked to before. We'll put a link up to it, where he really, I think it's 2 pages, really explains
order defined in the process of its emergence. Yeah. And Hayek, if you look at the use of knowledge, he says economics as a result, the economic problem in society is a function of the introduction of change. And Mises also talks about change as opposed to statics and whatnot. And so that develops the more mature Austrian understanding of the market process, which then Israel Kirzner picks on and develops later on.
So I'm going to bring you back now.
So we did money, we did socialism.
Correct my factual statement. Did the or endorse it? Did the participants on the socialist side concede defeat, or just the observers? Observers that, like Heilbronner,
at one time took that side.
But did Lerner?
No, because they were
already
passed away. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I over-exaggerated.
Well,
that.
no, I mean, there's some evidence, for example, that Lange. We have conflicting stories on Lange, right? So, for example, Lange went back to be in charge of planning in Poland, but he never implemented his own model of market socialism because he said, oh, no, it will never work. But then in 1967, he wrote an article where he says, if I had to debate with Hayek today, I'd say, what's the problem? I have this computer, and I'll just put it in a supercomputer. Yeah. So they get it, but they don't get it in some sense,
okay.
right? Yeah.
Let's leave that alone.
And then, so I mentioned...
I exaggerated. So we got two ideas so far.
And I want to give you a third one.
Okay.
Which I think that Mises...
We got 2.5, I'd say, because in addition to the socialist process, debate, we've got the whole way that the Austrian school and moderns look at the market process versus the Valrasian modern economist view of it's just a bunch of equations we got to solve.
I would think the other thing that is uniquely Mises' great idea is the universal applicability of the economic way of thinking to human action outside of the market context. So when he wrote his book Human Action, he develops what he terms develops the subject as what he calls praxeology, which is, if you take it literally, the study of human action, right? And this is the idea that the kind of what we would call today rational choice analytics or the economic way of thinking applies to the realm of law, the realm of politics, the realm of religion. All walks of life can be made sense of through the economic lens. That is the notion of purposeful human action. Some people have translated this universal applicability into pure choice theoretic model, right? In which case it's constrained optimization on all these
That's Gary Becker.
Yes, and there's an aspect of Mises' argument which goes along with that, but there's an aspect of Mises' argument in which the calculators are not necessarily mechanical.
Yeah,
right?
perfect.
So what happens is that I like to say that it's a rational choice model as if the choosers were human. A man named
Which they are usually.
Yeah, a man named William Jaffa wrote a review about Menger and Walras and Jevons early on, many years ago, and he called Menger, Jevons, and Walras dehomogenized. And he sums up Menger's position. He says, to Menger, man was not a lightning calculator of pleasure and pain. That was the critique of the standard optimization model. He says, to Menger, man was caught between alluring hopes and haunting fears. And I've always liked that literary line, and I think that we're purposive. Or another way to think about it is that Mises is postulating that human beings are capable but fallible.
Yeah.
Capable but fallible. And as a result, when you read like the first 100 pages of his treatise, Human Action, which I think is, personally, I think it's like the greatest book ever written in economics, but that reflects my biases.
Well, we're going to come to that in a sec.
But
give me a chance to wax more on that. Go ahead.
But the first 100 pages of that is both lays out the logic of economic action, but at the same time, this idea of the opening up of the choice dilemma that individuals face that deals with uncertainty and the coping with our ignorance, that allows for the role that institutions play in helping us ameliorate our uncertainty and our ignorance. So the notions of property rights, how various different economic environments, ecology, will force and channel our behavior such that they matter, rather than the idea that it's just that we are these robots that make these choices and therefore could succeed under any conceivable set of environments. And so I think that Mises is both generates and I think there's good history of thought textual evidence on this. So, for example, when you look at Buchanan's original pieces on applying the economic way of thinking to the area of voting and whatnot, he has right in there footnotes to Mises. When you look at Henry Manny and he's developing his ideas on the sort of the market for corporate control and things like that, he has footnotes about Mises and developing these ideas. So these guys all read Human Action because it came out in 1949. They were educated in English. And even Vernon Smith has pointed out that Mises's book came out and was very influential on the way it became part of the way they think, the background of their ideas. So I like to think of modern history of economics as having a kind of a critical nodal point of decisions, which is in the late 1940s. And on the one hand, you have Samuelson's book comes out, Foundations.
1948.
And then you have Mises and Hayek's Individualism and Economic Order, that's Hayek's book, and then Human Action by Mises. They come out in 48, 49, respectively. And what happens is that economics sort of basically neoclassical or modern economics splits in some sense, and one direction moves towards an institutionally antiseptic theory.
That's Samuelson.
That's Samuelson. Whereas the other one is one in which institutions, so it's choice, individual choice, filter, institutional filter, and then an understanding of economic outcomes. And the heavy lifting is done by comparative institutional analysis. And that's the focus on rules, the focus on property rights, the focus on the institutions within the market that enable entrepreneurship or impede entrepreneurship.
And the imperfection of psychology of the human being,
right.
of knowledge and the ability to transmit knowledge, transactions costs.
Right.
All that is in
this
the
other
Mises Hayekian tradition.
That's what I would argue. And therefore, you see things like, all the way from F.A. Hayek, like, for example, Nobel Prize, Jim Buchanan's Nobel Prize, Doug North's Nobel Prize. I'm getting out of order here. Ronald Coase's Nobel Prize, Vernon Smith's, Nobel Prize, but also in between, Alman Alchin, Harold Demsetz, Mansur Olson, Yale Brosen, a bunch of people
who didn't win Nobel Prize, but were great important scholars,
important people
in that tradition, in the Mises Hayek tradition.
And that tradition has been since the 1940s recognized but marginalized. So it's recognized but marginalized
It's not the flashier, sexier, glamorous part of the profession.
But when you think about
but it's still recognized. It's hard to remember.
It's
easy to forget.
And what you have to remember is that whenever the debates the rubber hits the road on these big debates, it comes back with a vengeance. So it was no surprise, for example, when socialism starts to crack up, that all of a sudden everyone's talking about the role of institutions and property rights and why that matters. Why? Because that society was a society which in fact didn't have institutions and whatnot, or had institutions, but they weren't the right institutions.
Effective, yeah.
And then when we have problems of fiscal imbalance, then all of a sudden Buchanan's work on the incentives within fiscal policy making, everything matter. And then when we have, obviously inflationary, issues and the problem of inflationary expectations and the lack of fiscal stimulus and all these things, all those arguments come back again to the forefront. So they've been recognized but marginalized, but they always seem to find a way to raise their ugly head right in the middle of the most important sort of debate. So to give you a quick example on this.
You meant beautiful head, but go ahead.
Yeah, what did I say?
You said ugly, but not ugly to you. So you like it.
Yeah.
But it's
not,
I
meant the environment it raises,
Oh, okay.
But yes, but I do mean the beautiful head. But if you go back and look at the Newsweek article that appeared, or the article that they talked about you in The Economist, and you go back to 1970s when we were having stagflation, similar type of articles about Hayek appeared then. Uh-huh. So it's not, now it is true that he won the Nobel Prize in 1974, and so he was the flavor of the day in some sense.
It was a quiet Nobel Prize.
Yeah, it was a quiet.
It didn't produce a groundswell of graduate students using his work to write their PhD theses. That's, I think, when you say recognized but marginalized, I read, as a first-year grad student in 1976, I read The Use of Knowledge in Society, but I was at the University of Chicago. Most grad students never, at the top programs, never read an article by Hayek or Mises ever, and still don't. They're out of fashion.
Yeah.
But as you point out correctly, they may be out of fashion, but they're not forgotten, and they come back to play a role in all kinds of ways.
And if you know a lot about their work, you see it in other marginalized but recognized people. So, for example, if you look at Lynn Ostrom's work that on property rights and whatnot, you can see arguments that she derives to a large extent maybe from Armin Alchian. But Armin Alchian got a lot of those arguments from, Hayek, and Mises or whatever. So there's like a kind of what's the 6 degrees of separation kind of rule. And so you just have to be very, excited about it. So anyway, just to say, so I would say in terms of contributions, I would look at Mises's contributions on business cycle theory, Mises's contributions on the critique of socialism, and derivative of that, his further and more mature understanding of the market as a dynamic process of entrepreneurial discovery. And then finally, his overarching sort of analysis of the pursuit of economics logic, or the logic of economics in areas outside of the market. So the development of public choice, the development of law and economics, the development of what might be called today modern institutional economics. A lot of all of that has its antecedent, I think is the right word, in Mises's idea. And I think if you think in terms of this split decision that took place, so either move in an institutionally antiseptic, formal theory direction, or in an institutionally laden sort of economics in which you interact between the theory of human action with the institutional contingencies to deal with our imperfections and our ignorance and the uncertainties of the world that steer dynamic behavior in direction. So
that's a great.
Yeah. So economics is about exchange and the institutions within which exchange takes place. That's very Smithian. Mises and Hayek are the modern Smithians in that regard. It's the man's propensity to truck, barter, and exchange, not man settling in on the equilibrium point, right?
Yeah. Let's, we're getting low on time. Let's talk about his most important works, which we've touched on, of course, in this conversation. What are his most important books?
Well, it's an interesting question that you ask. Mansur Olson, I used to be involved with the center that Mansur ran at University of Maryland. And he one time asked me, he said, "You're always talking about this Mises." He says, "I understand if I'm going to talk about Hayek that I'll get use of knowledge in society. But what is it that I'm going to read about Mises?" And I remember sitting there thinking, okay, this is a really difficult question because I'm now going to recommend a 1,000-page book.
Yeah, it's a lot for
and it's not what he wants. Yeah. So I guess if you said...
we're going to get to don't get to the guide yet. Let's first talk about...
No, so I'm saying
works.
I think that there's an argument to be made that his economic calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth article is the single greatest article that he wrote. And so if people want to get a sense of, the logic of Mises as an economist, pure economist, that probably is, his best article published in 1920. It's unbelievable, actually, the way in which he gets across his idea. And keep in mind the logic of what he's doing, because he's trying to get across not a normative argument, but a completely positive economic argument about why it is that the most appealing normative idea of his zeitgeist is fundamentally wrong. And so there's this sort of amazing kind of connection to that. And then I think that there are some essays that he wrote on the manipulation of money and credit, which you can get. There's the Ebeling collection that I mentioned at Liberty Fund, the selected works of Mises, has some essays that he wrote. And then some of his more popular books later on in life, sort of economic policy. These are all Liberty Fund has these books. The essays that are in that can communicate the idea of inflation, his strong argument about inflation.
But those are what you tell people to start with, which we're out of order.
Okay, sorry.
Talk about what are his most important?
The most important book that he did was Human Action.
Human Action,
and then Socialism, and then Theory of Money and Credit.
Okay, so those three, which are all available online at Library of Economics and Liberty.
Sorry, I misunderstood the question.
So those three, but the problem. And Hayek's got his own problem. I hope we'll do another podcast on that sometime. But the problem is, as you say, if you've been turned on by this conversation and you want to learn more about Mises' ideas, Human Action is a daunting book. It's 1,000 pages. Yeah. And it's not a
easy read.
It's not 1,000 pages of Robert Ludlum like prose. So would you recommend that someone try to wade through that to start with?
No, I mean, first of all, I think any attempt to read Human Action is awesome. So I would recommend that. But I do think there's ways to get the core argument to prepare yourself for maybe wanting to understand and read that. One of them is that Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State is a very readable translation in some sense of that work into a more modern English prose and a more plain language approach. So to me, Man, Economy, and State is a masterful work. It has its own unique contributions, which we could talk about on a different thing. But just a straight up economics, he makes Mises very, very plain. If that's too daunting for you, because that also is a huge book, Henry Hazlitt is a very good introduction to Mises as well in like the economics in one lesson. So, the understanding of the way in which Mises does that. Mises himself, I think a book like Liberalism is very readable, very short in the scheme of things, and it gets right to the kind of issues of liberalism and the relationship between economic theory and classical liberalism that a lot of listeners on this show and readers at Econ Law, Liberty or whatever would be interested in. The other thing is, I would say between the three books that I mentioned, Theory of Money and Credit, Socialism, and Human Action, that Theory of Money and Credit is in some sense Mises's most technical work in economics. It's very, very demanding in terms of your ability to understand monetary theory, the history of monetary theory. It rewards you tremendously if you read it, especially in our current context, because that's what's going on around us today. And Mises's book is just as lively today, but it is technical economics.
And it's challenging because the terminology isn't quite the same as what we use. And
it's 1912, and then, okay. And then Human Action is daunting because it's a mix both of refined points in economic theory mixed with a kind of ideological fervor that's a product of its age, meaning that you have right on the heels of Nazism, you have the development of sort of the interventionist economies in the West because they're going the wrong way. Mises used to say that he started out to be a theorist and he became a historian of decline. And so the book has that kind of rhetoric. I happen to, because I agree with him, I find the rhetoric charming, but someone like Israel Kirzner has spent his entire career trying to cull out of Mises the technical economics of the market process without the rhetoric of why the Führer is horrible or whatever. But socialism, I think,
the book.
Right. And remember, I mean, that's my background, right? So there's a little bias here. But to me, socialism is just this amazing intellectual achievement that sits between both worlds in some sense. You have the technical economics, a theory of money and credit, and the more broad sweeping economics of Human Action. And then you have this book, Socialism, which is an economic and sociological analysis, that's the subtitle, of this grand idea in which Mises is taking his opponents extremely seriously. He's trying to defeat them with logic and evidence, right? And he's taking them on. And to me, it's an amazing achievement of the human mind, and that I would recommend to any of the readers to pick that book up and wrestle with it. I think it's very well translated so that the English in it is extremely easy to read. I think it stays focused. Right? It doesn't try to make a contribution on every area of economics. It stays focused, and it deals with a topic that we still care about. There's discussions in there on the nature of the family and, nature of, sort of what we now would call green economies kind of thing. There's those kind of issues. All of that stuff is right there. Mises will talk about, the value of a waterfall and then talk about the problem in calculation with that and the nature of property rights. Sort of the real bottom line is that his syllogism, without private property and the means of production, there'll be no market for the means of production. Without a market for the means of production, there'll be no prices for those means of production. Without prices reflecting the relative scarcities, there's no way for the economic planner to be able to allocate scarce resources among the competing ends, right? That syllogism is then played out across all kinds of various different efforts at socialism in a way that I think is really a magisterial treatment. And so I would recommend Socialism, I think, It's just a little bit of a different twist today, because I think most people that would sit in this chair would tell you theory of money and credit today after we get off of human action, because it's about today, right? That's what we're going through.
But it's not so accessible.
Yeah.
And socialism,
I think, is more accessible and still passionate and everything like that. But then again, liberalism
book.
Is just, his book Liberalism is just amazing. In the 1920s, Mises wrote 3 books, Socialism, Liberalism, and a critique of interventionism. And he tried to go at each of the systems, right? So he argued socialism is impossible, interventionism is unstable, therefore undesirable, and liberalism, he tries to show, is both desirable, stable, leads to prosperity, all these things like that. So it's a trifecta there, right? And so, but he goes, there's not many alternatives, right? You have socialism, and then his next book on the...
by liberalism, he meant...
Our liberalism, the classical liberalism of
limited government,
a society of free and responsible individuals, private property. He says liberalism can be summed up in one word, or one phrase, private property, and the consistent and persistent application of that. And then what happens is when he comes in, in 1940, he publishes The Omnipotent Government, which is his critique of the Nazi state. So you have basically, Mises is a comparative systems economist. He's going to analyze socialism. He's going to analyze interventionism, which a version of that is the manipulation of money and credit in the business cycle. He's going to analyze liberalism, and he's going to analyze fascism. And so you have the whole gambit of systems there, and just this wealth and wonderful insights, I think.
My guest today has been Pete Boettke. Pete, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.